Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing good. You did pronounce it right the second time.
Okay, I
Late,
forgot already. How is it?
Leighton Radner.
Leighton Radner.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah. Nice to meet you. Most old people know the name because of Gilda Radner from SNL. So it
Oh,
depends on
God.
the age of the person. It's weird, like when I'm talking to people on the street.
So are you from Alaska, or is this just something you're...
No, I'm born and raised here in Alaska,
Okay.
and grew up in a little place called Big Lake, and now I live in Seward, which is a little like oceanside town over here.
Okay. Yeah, it's... Alaska's such a funny thing in that, like, yes, it's America, but it's kind of like almost forgotten.
Yeah,
Like we don't discuss what's going on in Alaska. You never hear about Alaskan news. Like, I think the only time I ever really heard about Alaska in any significant way is like when there's a reason to talk about Sarah Palin. Like, right? Like,
earthquakes.
That's like, yeah. Or occasionally like some oil thing or something, you know what I mean? Like, like some pipeline from Alaska into Canada or something. But for the most part, you don't, or ghost stories in Juneau,
Lots of those on YouTube.
Yeah. But you don't hear about Alaska that much. When you reached out to me, I get DMs from people sometimes, and I'm like, who the hell is this guy? And I'm like, all right, well, let me look at this fucking documentary this guy sent me, like, whatever. I click it and I'm like, this name sounds familiar, but like I couldn't quite remember. And then I heard that opening quote and I was like, all right, look, I'm hooked. I have got to talk to this guy. This is an interesting story. And then I started researching it and I watched your documentary and I was like, this is so wild that no one knows that, like, this is not talked about in libertarian spaces all of the time. Like, I know he wasn't a libertarian, right? Like, not in the Rothbardian Hoppian perspective.
Not in the traditional sense. I do tell people, there's and I'm gonna be talking with a few different like LP historians and folks along that line. But there was a claim made by Joe Vogler in the past that he co-founded the party, the LP here in Alaska. The problem is Ballotpedia, Lpedia, things like that, the like kind of websites that track a lot of the history of the Libertarian Party, they attribute it to another person. So I've been sort of trying to track down where that comes from, but no, he wasn't what I would call a traditional libertarian. He very well might have fallen in with libertarians of today, in a lot of ways, but there's definitely some separation there.
Well, he seems like a minarchist. Actually, he seems more like, from what I understand, he's a minarchist paleoconservative that is concerned with his community, his people, and it reminds me of kind of like the inklings of nationalism in the way that Bakunin described nationalism, like a love for your people, for your land, for your home, and not a love of the state.
It's commonly referred to around like Alaska, and I think there's even a Wikipedia entry that one of the old timers from the AIP made years ago is Alaskan nationalism. Sort of this like, and really I think that was born out of the Vogler sort of camp in that.
So, two things. One, three things. One, I want you to fully introduce yourself and like where you're from and where people can find you. Two, I do want to say that, like, while we are going to talk about Vogler, and I'm excited to do that, I also want to talk branching out and, weaved through this story a little bit. I'd love to talk to you about Alaska, Alaskan issues, libertarianism as you see it, and how that fits in with those things. And three, after you introduce yourself, I want to start with the very, very beginning of your documentary, because that quote, I think, really sums up the emotions that are necessary for why we should be paying attention to this story in his own words. So, like, please, first, tell people where they can find you, what you're about, and, like, who you are.
Yeah, so I do a show pretty much twice a week. I try to get 2 out a week. It's we're going there. But it's a show called OutlawThoughts, and I do that on OutlawThoughts YouTube channel, and then I do some shorter form videos on there too. But every month or so I'm trying to work on a new sort of political cold case, is sort of how I refer to it, or something that hasn't really been talked about in a long time in politics, typically surrounding death. A little bit of cult stuff too. I like that stuff a little bit. And so the Vogler one to me was different because that was more personal to that story. It was somebody I came across when I was pretty young in politics and had become interested in. But the next one I'm going to do is on a girl named Christian Snyder, who was a disappearance involving the Nexium cult. So that'll be an interesting one. And then I do the normal show is just me and Karine Mays, who's my co-host. We talk about just random news topics in a funny way. We try to have nuance on things.
Political cold case sounds like an amazing thing. Yes, I will. I'm linking you in chat right now, guys, the documentary. But I'm sure we'll go over a lot of that. He does it very well.
That was my first, I've edited for other YouTubers in the past, when I was sort of like 16, 17. That was my first time, like, sitting down and doing something myself. And after I did it, I'm like, I'm finding all the screw ups I did. And it's like, you know.
Look, there's a video right now on YouTube, right? And it has like 2, 3, 4,000 views. And it's the first video I ever put out on YouTube. And it's, do transgender people have narcissistic personality disorder? Right. And so I'm bringing my counsel.
Title.
Okay, dude. Okay. It is my worst video I have ever put out. And it's still one of the more popular ones. And every time like I see a new comment on it, I'm like, why is the YouTube algorithm not showing you content that, like, after I've learned how to edit a little bit and after I've like solidified my political philosophy, and like, why is it showing you one where there's like 20 other studies I could have shown, but I didn't because I didn't understand how to do a video essay at all. And it's in like, it's me in the corner with like a PowerPoint. It's like, it's so bad. And yet like people like it because the content is something they've never heard before. Right. It's about the idea, right? And the idea exploring, transgender individuals and the extremely high rates of personality disorders and the way that this community is being underserved, how the science is not serving them appropriately, how we're not helping these people because we're cramming ideology at them instead of actually trying to help them. And that may mean transition, that may mean, treating them for another comorbid disorder, etc. Instead, we're just pushing politics. People see that idea, they resonate with that idea. And I think that's probably going to be true for this video of yours. You probably won't be able to escape the idea that coming across a documentary about Joe Vogler is insanely interesting. So I'm going to start the video. I'm going to share it to us real quick. I just want to show this quote so that when people are like, who is this guy? This is who this guy is. And this is what hooked me. So let me just share screen quick.
Yeah, and I mean, the reason I opened it with this was because I thought this was sort of the most important, some of the most important statements he had made sort of on his, really his life and Alaska's existence in a way.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let's check this out for just a second.
And finally you say, why? Why do I owe that country anything? What they've done to my state, my country, what they're doing to it every day. They don't even give you time to forgive and forget. They come along with another regulation. But you get to thinking, well, why the hell do I owe them anything? And then you get mad. And you say the hell with them. And you renounce allegiance and you pledge your effort.
My bad, guys. I didn't realize it would do that.
Hell, do I owe them anything? And then you get mad. And you say the hell with them. And you renounce allegiance. And you pledge your efforts, your effects, your honor, your life to Alaska. That's how I do. I'm an Alaskan, see. And they know it. I've told them so, to go to hell in every way I can in a nice way. I took a case to the Supreme Court, believing in the Supreme Court that I'd rather be tried in a whorehouse with a madam as a judge. There's more justice. And if they don't like it, they know where they can go. I tried it. I believed in my country. I believed in the court system, and it stinks. They don't pay you for property rights they take away from you. We have patented ground that we haven't been able to use for 8 years. We put $300,000 in over there, and it's locked up, locked up for 8 years. My wife and I had a good time there. We didn't take 300, 400, 500 ounces out, a couple of kids. We had a good time there. They taken 8 years of our lives. She'll never be able to go back to the creek with me. And if you think I'm ever going to forget that, the fires of hell are frozen glaciers compared to my hatred for the American government. And I won't be buried under their damn flag. I'll be buried in Dawson. And when Alaska is an independent nation, they can bring my bones home, back to my country.
And
I was hooked. I saw that, and I was hooked.
He was buried in Dawson. He is not buried in the United States. He was buried over there. There's a place marker online too, so every time I drive through that area, that's like where I go. But his sort of story from that quote, I think it sums up a big part of his life, which the guy was very good at doing. There's very little of him recorded, which is a big issue. I tried to include as much as I could, but it's amazing the quotes the guy can generate in just conversation.
Yeah, I mean, there's something I've noticed about the communication of ideas, right? What I mean by that is I've noticed that people do not grasp onto ideas unless they're only ever so slightly more complicated than the ideas they already have, right? When an idea is too far gone and complicated, people don't attach themselves to that idea. They don't resonate with that idea. Instead, most people are they're not unless they're already receptive to the speaker, they're not necessarily intellectually curious enough to really investigate what it is that they don't understand about that idea. I notice this a lot when discussing argumentation ethics and like deep philosophy and libertarianism, is that like only the hardcore libertarians are willing to investigate what it is that means. Everyone else just goes, that's crazy talk, you're insane, etc. And there's something special about people like Joe Vogler that can take what should be complicated ideas in some ways, but speak about them in a passionate way that resonates with everyday Americans. And when I hear something like that, he's talking about patents. He's talking about, land rights to cross over national forestries and the permitting process, right? He's talking about so much in that quote. And really all he's saying is the government stole 8 years of my life and my wife's life, and the experiences that I wanted in our family and those things have been robbed from me. And I'll never fucking love those thieves that did that. And it's like, you hear that and it doesn't matter where you are intellectually or what your ideal and the philosophy is. You just know it's wrong and you feel it and you resonate. And it's amazing.
Yeah, so I mean, I can get sort of into how that situation arose and how he got to that point. But I think I think the way he talked, the way he did, the way he was able to kind of expand on those ideas in that way is because he came from sort of a working background and sort of came from that working the land mentality. So when he was talking to people in political terms, everything he was saying was simple because it was like, to him, it was like, this is easy in the sense that I can expand on these ideas to Alaskans, especially because at the time they were living through the same things. And then when you look at his background being in law, it sort of makes it even crazier because he had to have been conscious of the way he was doing this, the way he was telling people about this kind of concept.
So did he finish law school? He passed the bar, right?
He did pass the bar in Kansas, his home state. He wasn't actually born in Alaska. He moved to Alaska post World War II because he lost a job that he was working in Texas because he called FDR a commie bastard. Um, and
Every detail you learn about this guy, you're like, yes, I love this guy.
So he was not a fan of FDR, and he had written some opinion pieces in Texas about it. His employer and him got into some kind of argument that led to him being fired in those regards, and it was because of a quote that he had given in one of those letters, calling FDR a communist bastard. And then he gets fired from Texas and decides he wants to find some kind of new political home, really. He didn't seem to have much of a vision at that point. I think he was just looking for a job. So he went over to Alaska. He ended up actually going, I think the first place he ended up was Ketchikan, but he wound up in Fairbanks. He worked a little while for the Army Corps of Engineers when they were doing a lot of the infrastructure building, sort of Cold War era stuff up here, which gave him sort of an insight into what the state was being used for. Because at that point, the military federally had already realized sort of the value of Alaska, which was really as a sort of
its proximity to Russia,
and its proximity to Russia, China, the ability to sort of use it as a reconnaissance hub almost, which is still to this day what it is. I mean, it houses a big portion of our anti-nuclear defenses, things like that, nuclear submarines and the likes.
It's really interesting because you go into the documentary about the kind of the sorry, I think I'm getting picked up on your mic ever so slightly.
Oh, I can it's probably the echo settings. I can do that real quick.
Yeah. If it was that worked. So what's really interesting that I found was the kind of the way Alaska becomes a state, and the way that the federal government moved in all of these federal workers towards this. What's even more interesting is it was like it made me recall something. My grandfather actually was moved to Alaska by the federal government in the 70s after it was already a state. And he did, I mean, I don't know a whole ton of his history there, but he worked for the Forestry Service, and like he did a bunch of stuff. He was a firefighter that eventually was a firefighter.
They were involved in all of the national parklands up here at post-statehood. By the 70s, most of that was divvied up, so they gave a lot of forestry guys.
Okay, go back to whatever setting you had before, because it was way better.
Yeah, so they when he moved over here, there was the statehood hadn't quite happened yet, and so he was here for sort of the beginning of that. And to get more into that, I mean, what I do in the documentary is actually adapted from an article I had written and never really published from forever ago on statehood, because it was something historically I had been very interested in. A lot of people take for granted that, we talk about things like secession and the arguments from the South and all this, and that gets brought up sort of almost nonchalantly now in politics. But there are states that were admitted to the Union fairly recently, with Alaska and Hawaii. And with both of those, they got very raw deals, in the whole statehood process, with Alaska practically being stolen, in a sense, being that the purchase was made far before statehood really took place. The murmurs of statehood had started back in the early 1900s, all the way back then, but it had been sort of fended off by the public. But going into sort of the post-World War II, Cold War era, it became much more apparent that wasn't really going to happen. They had a constitutional referendum, which involved having these votes deciding on whether the people of Alaska wanted statehood to move forward. And this is before it was allowed to move forward anywhere else. And those are really the votes that made the decision. And when those votes were held in the late 50s, the Army, as well as just what existed at that point of National Park Service, just federal workers in general, were pushed into the state and pretty much universally given the order that you're going to be voting for statehood. Now, what I don't want to put out the idea is like everybody was individually taken aside and told this is what you're going to do. But in reality, it is that if the people who are signing your check is not the people who lived there in the state before you, and are rather the people who are asking for statehood, then you're going to be far more likely to vote for statehood. And so they
we see something. We see something too with like Crimea, right? Where a lot of people have left and fled Crimea, so we don't know what their opinions are because they're no longer there. And there's dubious polls back and forth, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also, you know, you see like, well, it's like, well, the Russians own all the jobs here. Like, so like, right. Of course the people, you know, many of the people, you know, want to remain with Russians. And then there's some polls that have split it where it's like they're only reporting how many people want to stay with Russia versus how many people want to, you know, go with Ukraine, but like they're not putting in the poll the amount of people that wanted independence from both. And like I have no idea what the polling data is in that regard. But I wanted to set that aside. When the person that writes your paycheck and gives you your job is also depends on you to vote that they have the power to do so, which is to be a state. Like, why would you vote? Like, you're voting against your own self-interest as an employee in favor of your self-interest as an Alaskan Native, which you aren't. So, like, how was statehood ever not going to be a thing?
Right. And so that was made apparent. Now, the numbers are very hard to sort of ascertain because they're, you know, the existence of censuses in the state were not really existing. So it's right. Tricky to find population densities, things like that. Now, I've had the ability to talk to people who are around in that day and age of statehood and older folk that were not really politically active and didn't have any, you know, they didn't care who won regardless. And they have said that you're talking anywhere between, you know, 20 to as high as 45% of the population at the time of the actual vote taking place being military or federal workers of some kind, or the family, you know, adult family voting age right. of those equivalent. Because
the household people, was like employed in that way. A
lot of times you're not traveling on your own. You've got, you know, your wife, and you might have a kid who is of age, things like that. So it skews the votes. The statehood becomes a reality at that point after Vogler has already come to Alaska.
So yeah, to recontextualize this for the audience, right? Like the reason we're talking and getting into the weeds about like the dubious circumstances of the statehood of Alaska is, I think, really important to this entire conversation, is recognizing that the general populace of the Alaskan Native still, you know, holds at this time in the 50s and 60s and 70s, still holds a mindset that had largely died off in the American colonies, which was this idea that I'm a Virginian first, a United States citizen second, right? People before the Civil War, for example, the language of individuals was, you know, the United States of America are a good place to live. And after the Civil War, it was changed to colloquially, it was changed to the United States of America is a good place to live, because the psychology of the people had changed, that it actually changed the language. People would say, where are you from? Or who, like, you would not say, I'm an American or I'm from America. You would say, I'm Virginian. I'm a Virginian. And I, you know, happen to live under this confederation of states and a federal government that is the United States of America. And Alaska still kind of had that. And leading up to this Cold War and during this Cold War proceedings, Alaska is all of a sudden seen by the state as this really valuable resource. There's oil there, there's minerals there, there's proximity to Russia, there's all of this. There's not a large population. And so it's very easy for them to move in and kind of, I don't want to say steal the state, because it's not something that can be proven.
Right.
But there was certainly state interests that weren't necessarily in a line with the interests of the Alaskan Natives, that kind of pushed on an almost capturing of the state, its identity and its people. And And Vogler is coming into this, and his ideas obviously are ideas that formulate the Alaskan Independence Party, which is kind of the whole thing we're getting into.
Right. So, and to push forward into that kind of space, he realizes sort of early on, he has some sort of political battles. There was a bridge in Fairbanks that he sued a private company over, but the private company was servicing the college through the government. And it basically was a situation where when the bus was operating, nobody else could go on the bridge because it wasn't wide enough. And so it was a service issue. The lawsuit failed, but it turned a lot of people publicly to sort of start paying attention to him, because a lot of people were irritated by the bus thing in town in Fairbanks. And so that became sort of putting his name on a map in a sense in Alaska. And then he started writing opinion letters and things like that in the local paper to Fairbanks, which is at the time was the second largest city. It still is. And he started writing opinion letters in Anchorage, which is the largest city. And his opinion letters basically consisted of him voicing his opinions with issues of the federal government coming in, talks about the National Land Acts, how much of the federal land was owned by the feds versus the state, which made it so that miners and things couldn't really operate. And that moved him into really what his kind of money came from and why he was able to do the things he did, which is he got into purchasing a large plot for mining, as well as beginning to do some land development. He purchased some lots, which he turned into building lots, and then built a couple apartment complexes, things like that.
It really is reminiscent too. You know, there was something I learned in sociology in terms of governance and people's ideas of governance is, you know, we tend to think that the ideas that really activate people are ideas of freedom, independence, or, you know, these high-brained meta things. But what people notice is that there is a submerged state. Most people don't think about the state. And there are two things that are the most important things when it comes to how people view their local government: trash and snow removal. When trash removal and snow removal stops working or isn't done appropriately, people start to realize that the people in power aren't doing their job, right? So long as they don't notice the government, they don't care that the government takes a chunk of their money and imposes rules and regulations, because ultimately they still drive to work, they still have a family, they still do their day-to-day shit. And I think Joe Vogler coming in and being like, this bridge is fucked up, we can't use this bridge. Like, why the fuck can't we use a needed bridge? Like, either build us a different fucking bridge or let us use the goddamn bridge. And people are like, yeah, why the fuck can't I use that bridge? And I think it's it sounds mundane, it sounds boring, but that's actually how you start a movement, is with pointing out the inefficaciousness of these little day-to-day things.
And you know, to give you an idea too of Fairbanks at that point where he was doing that at, you really didn't have much of a sense of central planning in early Alaska, up until the 40s really. And then post World War II, you start to see these sort of the town structure that is really sort of applied across, you know, most cities. And so still to this day, once you break away from the main cities in Alaska, there is really no rhyme or reason anymore. People build according to the land. So you'll see, you know, areas that don't have any homes, and then the second you find a nice hill that somebody liked the view, there's a home because they like
right.
You know, which I find, you know, is sort of similar outside like rural areas to the South, and I see that in Florida a bit too, but I don't see it as much in a lot of other areas, because it's but that's sort of the context he was living in. People were sort of uneasy seeing the cityscapes pop up, the kind of highway systems, things like that come to fruition in the state. And so he argues with them in the court about this, and he starts writing the opinion letters. And, you know, after that point, he really starts to, you know, move on to other stuff after 59 when the lawsuit ended. So we're going into sort of the 60s, which is a different era, you know, contextually in the rest of the U.S., But what I try to tell people is culture in Alaska is sort of very slow moving compared to the rest of the United States. I have a feeling it's similar in Hawaii. I had family from over there in Hawaii, so I know it's somewhat similar there. It doesn't really advance as fast, and what I mean by advancement isn't necessarily advancement, because I think
doesn't progress as fast.
Right. When Vogler was around, there was a lot more contention towards the government in general. And that was just sort of the culture of Alaska as a whole, because there was sort of this air of, it is true, a lot of the people who came to the state early on, post the big mining booms of the early 1900s, sort of in the 30s and 40s, a lot of them were people who said, I don't like the military thing going on in the 40s. I don't like, the politics of these other individual states, or I don't like the state, the federal political field. It was people who had gotten wrapped up in crime. So they needed somewhere that they could go that they weren't going to be necessarily chased after. And so that was really what Alaska, the culture that existed here existed because of that. You had a lot of people who were just not fans of having people show up at their door. That kind of
an outlaw culture to an extent.
Exactly. And I mean, really, you still have some of that going on. There are areas where it's not really city, a lot of in and out travel, where it is still sort of like that to this day, where you have like tribal police, things like that handle most of the problems, and it's a different sort of setup. I think that there's something to be said about that style of living. I definitely find myself liking it to an extent, but there's people are going to have different opinions on it. But he certainly sort of by 1959, the end of that, just went into opening a mine. He bought the land, he bought everything to sort of set things up, and then he continued sort of just mining and developing throughout the 60s, and he wrote a lot of opinion letters. He was getting a little more politically active throughout that time, but there's not as much sort of documentation on that era, so it's sort of hard to parse everything out. But by the 70s, like 1972, he had over 300 acres of land in total from his mining stuff and his development properties and things, which in Fairbanks made him fairly wealthy, one of the wealthier people in the town at that point, up there with the top 500, whatever that would be. And so he started voicing his opinion and actually had a little more weight behind it, because now he's a developer and he has a little more, just sort of people hearing his voice out front because he has money, and so people listen to you a little bit more. But at that point, the state was sort of kind of going after land developers and miners, especially. Like, miners really were the main one, because mining at that point had sort of fallen out of favor with the government, because in the 40s, and most people don't realize this, when they ban gold, and everybody talks about that whole process, well, Alaska was still pulling gold out of mines here. I live in a town that was right next to one of them, and they were literally pulling gold out of those mines until the day they were closed. And they weren't closed by the miners, they were ordered to blow them shut, because the government claimed that they were concerned that the Japanese or Chinese would invade the United States through Alaska, and they would use those mines to collect resources. So they wanted them blown shut so the resources couldn't be utilized. And
where the fuck is the logic in that? Like, the more
it doesn't exist.
Like, the more I look into the Alaska, right? Because it's just not a state you think of when you're researching your own nation's history, right? But it just seems like bureaucracy, red tape, corporations, and special interests have all vied for the resources of Alaska and have completely destroyed any ability for growth or business or production or manufacturing or anything I mean, I had to pause your documentary and look it up when you were talking about permits that were required to move equipment. I was like, is this real?
Yeah.
It was impossible to transport materials, but not just materials. Importantly, the heavy mining equipment anywhere in Alaska, because like something like 65% of Alaska right now is owned by the federal government. And then they require massive amounts of documentation and red hoops and, fill out this letter, give it to us on Thursday. Oh, the person's not in the office on Friday, so we'll get back to you on Monday so that you can move your equipment from one site to another site, completely just destroying the ability for these businesses to operate. And it's like, it's no wonder that Alaska is, pardon my French, and, I'm not trying to insult you, but it's an underdeveloped shithole in a lot of ways. Like there's a lot of, there's just not an economy there that should be there from the amount of pressure that the state has put on, and a lot of non-existent kind of like local jobs that should exist around a lot of these places that have been arbitrarily controlled, shut down, or simply priced out by the red hoops of the state.
Yeah, the easiest way for me to sort of give examples to people that you can sort of see in real time is just at any given moment look up the cost of a gallon of gas in Anchorage, Alaska, which is the largest city in the States where the fuel's the cheapest, and then look up the average gallon, or look up the average gallon of gas in both Alaska and DC, Washington, DC. Washington, DC produces nothing, right? They have no oil, they have no natural gas, they have no mines, they have no bedrock to speak of. And Alaska...
Right, so it's $3.67 in DC.
Right.
All right, let's look up Anchorage. $3.88. So it's 20 cents more expensive in the most populated region in Alaska, where we're getting a large portion of our oil from our crude oil.
And this is the beauty, and leads perfectly into sort of the next part of the story here with Vogler, is that, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline's built in the early 70s. They put this thing in. They say, this is going to make everything cheaper for Alaskans, da-da-da-da-da. In the reality, what this did was it installed a spigot, and that spigot's controlled by the federal government, not the state government. And so the beautiful thing about, myself as a libertarian, and I think Vogler in his position was able to see very quickly, is all of these contextual proxy wars, all of the conflicts, all of the things that people talk about being in context of natural resources, those don't make very much sense if you have a state like Alaska that can produce the amount of natural resources that it can. And so it almost makes more sense for the government to keep that spigot off in Alaska than on. And so that's sort of what we've seen over the last 50 years is exactly what Vogler was talking about in the first place in the late 60s, where he was saying things like they're going to take the control of all the natural resources and then turn this place into a warehouse. And really what that looks like in context is there isn't any gas production here. And then the reason the fuel cost is high here and the reason these things exist here is because we're not allowed to produce anything here. The state the state, private, doesn't matter. You can't collect the oil. And when I talk about like oil, gold, things like that, I don't think most people won't do the like nitty gritty research, but when you look into how much oil is present in Alaska, it is mind boggling, in context to states like Texas and these things we see as oil mecca states, places that overproduce oil.
So what you're saying, right, is the incentive structure for the United States government is with its control over Alaska and everything, right, is they're looking at a landscape that says, okay, our dollar, our currency is based on a fiat currency that needs oil trading in the Middle East because there is trillions of dollars of oil that is being traded in, Brazil, Argentina, China, Europe, etc., where we are the reserve currency for that trade over there. And in Alaska, we have large amounts of oil and gold, both of which, if we allow too much of into the market, it will destabilize our position as the reserve currency for Middle Eastern oil production and sales. And if we allow Alaska to gain wealth from deregulating the mining industry, allowing another gold mecca, allowing another oil mecca, exporting all of these things, yes, we will have those resources, and that'll be great. But what we may lose is our status as the US dollar that's built upon nothing as the reserve currency, and hyperinflation as that money comes back into the American market. So what we need to do is maintain a reserve currency in Alaska that we can use in the event of World War III or something, but we can keep those people poor and destitute and strangle what comes out of there so that we can maintain our global hegemony. And the people that really suffer economically are the Alaskans that have all of these resources that they can't get rid of because the federal government says no.
Right. And on top of that, the sort of compounding that has caused in the markets here is that, obviously the job stagnation, which is caused from it, which just slowly erodes the sort of populace that can remain in the state of Alaska. Now, I will say that's done sort of good things in rural areas, because typically the people who stay are the family of people who were there previous, so they understand sort of how to make money in their own way without needing the sort of state entanglements, which there still is a lot of that rurally here. But once you move anywhere with a population, that sort of ceases to exist now, because you have the sort of government structure that came in and replaced what was there before. And with the resources becoming what they became, Vogler in 72, he writes this big letter talking about the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, pointing out that at that point, less than 0.5% of all of Alaska was owned by private parties, and the rest was all owned by the state or federal government. And now, today, it's 4% private, 36% state-owned, and then 60% give or take federally owned. But those numbers fluctuate between the state and feds by like 5% every few years. The biggest,
Jesus Christ. I mean, you move on from that, but I mean, as a libertarian, to hear, hey, you have this place that's economically undeveloped, that has stagnant population. What might account for this? Oh, I don't know. 96% of all of the land and resources is owned by the state in some capacity. I wonder why it's not fucking being developed appropriately.
Well, I talk about this a lot on my show in context with the national parks, and I think on both sides politically, pretty much on all fields, I see some people who will talk in favor of them, and I'm like, I don't think you understand. Like, the national parks were created as sort of an arm for them to come in and take land and just go, we have sort of say over this. And the permitting process, all that stuff, was all born out of the national park system, because it gave them the ability to literally just tell the states, you can't do anything about it. And the states really are in a position where, unless they want to, like, literally have military action, that kind of thing, go back to the Whiskey Rebellion type stuff, that just ain't gonna happen. So, the states always fold. And so, I've seen similar things with the distilleries back in the day in the South and stuff, where the state just basically sold the land out from under them, and the feds come in and take over. So I think there was a context that was there was an idea in everybody's mind, especially in the Vogler camp in the early 70s, that was sort of what was going on. And so this led to him getting together with a group of miners, about 15 or so people in the area, and sort of putting together this concept of at first signing this petition for basically a redress, the idea that Alaska should have a vote on secession. And what he was referencing was never when I say secession and when he said it, it was never in the same context as, say, like a Southern argument, neo-Confederate argument, which is what often gets lobbed towards the AIP guys. It was more in the context of a legal argument. Vogler saw it as the vote for statehood was originally it wasn't correct in the first
bullshit,
place,
yeah,
because a large portion of the population should not have been included in the vote because they were not residents of the state in the same way as the other voting population. And he was a lawyer, and so every argument he ever made on paper was in a legal context. He never made an argument for secession based on his opinion. It was his opinion of the law. And when he called for those things, he wasn't calling for we should secede. He was saying the people should have a right to vote the same way they did for statehood again. And if they don't vote for it this time, then the statehood was null and void to begin with. It never should have been held in place. And this would have reverted Alaska back to you could call it a commonwealth or a region or whatever you wanted to refer to it as. It would return it to Alaska in his eyes. And so this petition circulated.
Starting to see why they killed this guy.
Right.
I don't want to jump the gun, but, stick around, chat. Like, this story gets wilder.
So he ends up getting thousands of signatures. I think the number I quote it in the documentary, but it's escaping my head. I think it's either 10 or 50 or 20,000, somewhere in that range, which was a pretty decent chunk of the population. I think the population at the time was like 190,000, something like that. So the argument he was
getting 5 to 10% of the entire population to sign a petition saying, like, we want to revote.
Right. And so he was hoping to hear something back from Congress. That was sort of the goal, was to get some sort of response so that he could open up a line of communication. At that point, he was addressing himself as sort of a businessman, an investor in Alaska, things like that. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and that sort of ticked him off. It ticked a lot of the other miners that were involved in the whole thing and developers. And so he decided the next step would be to create a party, which at that time in Alaska really hadn't been done. Like, they had the process for third parties and stuff, but there really hadn't been one that was popular. And so in 1974, he creates the Alaskan Independence Party. And that sort of purpose for that party at the time, its main call was to get a vote, a revote on independence. He wrote this cover letter that used to be displayed on posters that basically laid out the legal argument in very simple terms. And he began sort of living a lifestyle that was more attuned with somebody who felt as though he didn't live in the United States. He lived in the state of Alaska. It wasn't until his battle with the National Park Service and with the feds that he really started to get more radical on the idea of this can't continue in the way that it was, because it was going to be set in stone. And this was really kind of built up, again, with that permit process. He didn't like the fact that you couldn't utilize his own mining property. He owned 200 acres of mining land in off the Steese Highway in Fairbanks, which is a beautiful area. And if anybody has a couple $1 million lying around, that land is actually for sale. His mine is currently for sale. I wish I was a rich man, because there's actually still gold out there.
I want to be honest with you. You don't really lay out a good case for wanting to buy mining land in Alaska.
You know
to
what?
Be fair.
You're not wrong. It is beautiful property, though. No, he builds out the property out there and stuff, and so he was accessing that mine through this area called the Bindenberg Trail. And that Bindenberg Trail had been around for, since the 1800s, mid 1800s, 1840s. He was utilizing the Muskeg Trail, which is a trail that goes across what they call muskeg, which is like where a lot of moss buildup happens and the animals like shitting on it, so it like builds up this natural manure. And so that's what he was driving across to access the mine. But the trail that he was using was technically a trail. It had been used, documented, going back all the way to the 1930s by different mining groups in the state. So, and the National Highway Act and certain things that were passed by the Congress stated that if you were a U.S. citizen, you could build a highway anywhere you wanted for anybody to use as long as it was public access. So,
so his argument isn't so much, hey, the government stole this land, coming from someone that is, a bit of a strict constitutionalist and in legal mind, he's saying, look, this is common property that has been utilized by the people here as a trail since the 1800s. You came in and you said you own this land. Well, I don't think you own this land, but even if you do, your own laws state that we can build a fucking highway so long as everybody can use it upon this land so that I can access the mine that I need to access in order to make a living.
Precisely. And when what ended up kind of confluencing in this is he didn't get permits. He didn't believe in the federal permit system because he believed that he was correct on the law. And so while he was utilizing the system after starting the AIP, this is about 10 years after, and I'll get back to one important thing that happened right before this that puts things in context, but they landed 2 helicopters on him while he was operating 2 pieces of his mining equipment. He was there with 2 other employees of his who were both younger, in their early 20s. And what they did was they went out there with federal marshals and federal wildlife employees, and they actually made him shut down his vehicles and leave them right where they sat. And they took him back on the helicopters back towards town and ended up giving him a bunch of fines and fees and stuff, which led to a Supreme Court case. But while this was going on, Vogler,
Alaska State Supreme Court, right?
Right.
It didn't go to the Scots.
State, yes. Supreme Court, yes. So he, it was his belief, and he has stated as much, that he believes at that point that they may have been trying to kill him. And one of the reasons he has referenced that, and tried to timeline it in the documentary because it's tricky, but that took place in 1984. In 1980, Joe Vogler took what he saw as sort of a last step in trying to make an argument against statehood. And the way that he decided to do that was by petitioning the UN, the United Nations. Now, up until 2020, that document was sealed. And so all we sort of had of it was bits and pieces. But as of 2020, that got released by the UN. So I have parts of that in the documentary, but it's in their archive. And what he did was he made an argument to a specific part of the UN to redress them on the case of Alaskan independence. And you had to get another person, a sponsor who was already a figurehead in the UN. And in the 80s, he hadn't gotten that, and nothing had really happened with it. It sort of went stale for between 82 and 86. The document sort of just sat in limbo, and he was writing them back and forth, but nothing really happened. But the AIP started making headway in politics. They started getting smaller candidates, city council members, things like that, winning seats. And so he did sort of have a bit of paranoia that, if the feds wanted to get rid of him, this would be sort of the time they would do it.
Spoiler alert, ladies and gentlemen, it may not have been paranoia. Continue.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm
and
hooked.
so yeah, and he does go into talking when he was doing an interview with Margaret Van Cleve in Fairbanks. He talks about the fact that there were what he believed body bags brought with the national wildlife guys and the marshals and things like that. And so he was sort of alert to that stuff. He was definitely on his toes. And
Well, to be fair, they didn't kill him, right? So,
right, you're right. Well, so
he might have just been a little paranoid.
He attributes that to the fact that during the confrontation, a Cessna 182, which is I think it was a 182, a very small cub plane. It's often used by bush pilots here in Alaska because they can sort of land anywhere and they're very cheap. Flew overhead and made a couple passes of them while they were parked with the helicopters. And he mentions that the wildlife marshal guy asked him whether or not they were with him. And he said, "What do you mean? No, I figured he was with you," kind of thing. And he later found out that that was a private resident of Fairbanks who simply saw what was going on and flew overhead just to sort of check it out. And what Vogler said was that possibly might have been what sort of saved his life, because if they thought, hey, there's somebody there who could see something, if we, take somebody out in the middle of the snow here, it might cause a bit of a problem.
we got to kill Joe. We got to kill these two young men, and then we got to kill like whoever's in that plane, and we don't know who the fuck they are. And
yeah,
now this is too much of a hassle. Let's find the fuck out of this guy and bury him in paper, which wasn't working up until that point, but nevertheless.
Mm-hmm. So there is a documentary on YouTube called The Battle of Weber Creek, which was made years ago by Public Access here in Alaska. It's available for free on YouTube. It covers some of Joe's life and has some great footage of him talking and stuff. Some of the few camera footage we have, and I include some of that in my documentary just because I can, because it's public access.
Right? Yeah. Why wouldn't you?
I'm
a libertarian. I don't believe in IP.
I do suggest watching that one too, because it does get into more of this side of the legal part of this battle, where he sort of goes into, and there's some great quotes in it. But eventually what goes on from that is he takes it to the state Supreme Court. And really what ends up going on is the Supreme Court here had not dealt with very many cases in the first place. And they just did not understand the federal law the way that it was written, and they're trying to interpret things that I just don't think they really got a grasp on. And that was really the argument Joe made to them in the court, was that you guys don't get the rural trail system here. You don't understand how this whole process works. Like, we have these records that show that these trails were used. I mean, we have mining reports going back to 30s, things like that were excluded. And it led to him losing that case. And because he lost that case, in the process of that, his wife, Doris, passed away. And he lost access to his mining property, which absolutely crushed him. And that's where that quote from the beginning of it comes from, is that's sort of his realization that he's not going to view things the same way that he was previously. He was sort of fed up.
It says that, that the government stole 8 years of his life from him, that she'll never be able to go access the crick. And that, what does he say? If you like something about hell, like the
frozen glaciers, the frozen glaciers, of hell will be frozen over before I'll, God, I don't
compared to his hate of the federal government. Yeah, we played in the beginning.
Yeah.
Definitely go back and watch it again, or watch the documentary that was linked several times in chat, because it's great.
And
but we'll continue.
That led to probably one of the things that he's most quoted as, which is that he will not be buried in the United States, or he won't be buried in Alaska as long as it's the United States. He wants to be buried in Dawson, which was a town like Canada between the Yukon, where a lot of mining was done in the early days. And to me, I think that was his sort of final middle finger, like I'm
Yeah.
not even going to be buried here. You guys don't get me. But he goes, from there, the AIP really sort of all at once kind of picked up traction. And it picked up traction because Vogler had previously put weight behind a candidate for governor that really was sort of not really working out. And so he had this concept. He wanted to change out the candidate that they had for somebody who was more well-known that wanted to switch parties. And so he started looking for somebody that was willing to do that, because he didn't necessarily need to win the office and make change as much as he did need to win the office to cement the AIP as either the second largest party or even largest party, which was sort of his goal at that point.
Yeah, it's like picking Gary Johnson, but actually winning.
Yes, exactly.
It's like no libertarian is fired up about Gary Johnson.
Right. So basically,
he never was. But it was like, yeah. But he figured it out.
He tapped Jo Jorgensen out of the race and replaced her with a new guy who was named Walter Hickel. And Walter Hickel actually won and became governor of the state. And he won under the AIP banner. Walter Hickel was a previous Republican. He had been very well known in the state. But
what year was that? Was that like 90, 91?
It was 91 or 1990, actually, I believe, is when he won. And then 90. Yeah, I think 90, 91. Yeah. But he
Virginia. Now that I think about it, Virginia and Jersey are the only two states that have off-year governor elections, right? So it would have to be an even year. Yeah, it would have to be 90.
But he wins, and that really, I mean, I don't think in context, like historically, he's one of the most recent third-party people to ever hold the governor's seat. He's like, and which. The idea of that happening today is insane. Like, that you would switch a candidate last minute, change parties, and then that person would go on to win. Like, today is, like, just not something people see in politics, is like, especially not as a governor. But he won the race, and it made Joe Vogler, because he was the chair head of the AIP, it made him the head of the party that was in charge of the whole state, which was a pretty big deal at that point. And obviously at that point he had money, he didn't really need to work, and so he really was focusing full time on.
Well, it's also a big deal, spoiler alert, it's a big deal because, if anyone's been listening this whole time, we have this document sitting at the UN where Alaska wants to petition the United Nations for independence, and yet they can't because they can't get a sponsor from another country. But all of a sudden, the guy that's filling out this document is now the head of the party that is in control of the state that wants to petition the United Nations. It's very like, these people have now fought to take back their state as a party, even if Winkler? Sorry.
Hickel.
Hickel. I don't know why I said Winkle. It's a silly fucking name. Even with him, not being a hardline individual, he's still represented by that party. That changes the political landscape drastically in terms of Alaskan independence.
Right. And when this happens, there was sort of a shift. You started to hear more people just in general, whether they were talking positively or negative. Everybody sort of was, in a way, was talking about independence and secession, redressing, and the whole vote process and stuff, sort of to become more kind of in the public sphere. And, Vogler pushed Hickel to push for votes for independence, and Hickel really wasn't feeling like doing it, and so it was sort of this contentious argument back and forth, but Hickel was still a good candidate, and he was still making good decisions, so it was sort of this sort of win-lose situation the way Vogler had it in place. But Vogler, wanted to continue to push the problem. He took out these one-page ads in the biggest paper in the state, that, and again, this is during the Cold War, and he was portraying the United States as Russia as the USSR, and as Alaska as Lithuania.
Yeah.
And this, it became sort of a very well-known, like, cartoon sort of portrayal that people used to have up on their walls and things like that. In bars, you'd see them and stuff. And there was a quote that comes from this sort of day and age that Vogler was using often, which was Alaska, home of the individual, and things like that, that became sort of known in the state as coming from that movement. And he tries to push Hickel to do the independence vote. It doesn't really work. And so he starts pushing again with the UN documents. And at this point in 1989, right previously before Hickel got into office, there was communication sort of began. But what had happened was in 89, Ali Khamenei came into power again in Iran. And he wasn't a fan of the United States. He didn't like the power structure here. And he did horrible things. But the reality, he wasn't a great world leader either. But the reality is that he didn't like the U.S. And he saw Vogler as somebody sort of attacking, the hegemony system that was going on. And so there were letters.
Iran is obviously coming out of an intense history, with Reagan, but also, just before Reagan, we have, they had
reasons not to like the U.S.
Yeah, you have Carter, right? You have the Carter, you have the hostage situation, the overthrowing of the Shah. Then you have, Reagan coming in, and Reagan basically funneling Iraq to, create the Iranian civil war, using those assets, as a means of, funneling a drug war in the South and Iran-Contra and all that good stuff. Like, these people fucking hate the U.S., and anything that is a blow to the United States is a win for them at this point. And this is 91 to 93. This is just coming out of that. Like, this is a memory fresh in their minds.
Right.
Like, it's not like the current Iran that hates us for ideological reasons and historical reasons. These are people that just lived through America doing everything it could to destroy their country.
Yeah, and I have, my co-host is Middle Eastern. I stream. I've had some Iranian people on my show, and I've talked to some of them in passing. I used to practice Judaism and things like that, and so I've met a lot of Middle Eastern people just in general on the internet. And it's amazing to me. Like, you talk to some of the older people from that region, and you realize, like, the amount of carnage that was levied like on those people is insane during that day and age. So it's crazy, like the just carpet bombing places for no reason, that kind of just
did it ever really stop?
No, not. And probably still, it's still going on as we're recording, I'm sure.
As at the time of this recording, let's see, where is America still carpet bombing people and or funneling money to terrorist organizations like Al-Nusra? Let's see that we know of. We have Somalia, we have Yemen, we have the Sudan, we have Syria.
We have, I was going to say Syria. Kareem would want me to say that.
Yeah, right. You know what I mean? In Syria, we're not really bombing. We're just funneling weapons through, to Al-Nusra, both from Turkey and, et cetera. Yeah, but come on. So, the idea that once he gained enough influence for people to recognize him as a legitimate speaker, the idea that he would find backing from Iran isn't really that inconceivable. But before that, it would have been. So the issues that the federal government had with him were like, oh, who's this one guy is an upstart that lost his state Supreme Court case. Now it's this guy who's in charge of the party that's in charge of this state that is our little piggy bank that we need to sit down, shut up, and keep the resources low so that we can maintain global hegemony in the Middle East. And I think recognizing the dollar and its play in oil, I don't think the Iranians are that stupid. I think they did also recognize that if Alaska were to gain independence and start selling oil and selling gold, that massively would weaken the power of the United States dollar and its ability to be impactful in the Middle Eastern politics.
And the other thing that I think, at the time too, you have this sort of argument being made, especially in the 90s. There was a debate being had with the close of the Cold War in 91 as to whether or not Alaska would sell oil to Russia. And there was this small sort of micro debate happening as to whether a pipeline, because Alaska's only 52 miles at its closest point from Russia. So the idea was, why don't we just build a pipeline?
How many times have I heard that during the McCain?
Oh God, yes, I know.
How old are you? I'm sorry.
So I'm 23. I was like politically aware right as McCain and Palin were around. So that was sort of my first political like realization of, oh my God, this is the person you like. I remember when McCain picked Palin and everybody in my family was like, well, he just like destroyed his chances, huh? Like, because by the way, I'm from Big Lake, which is relatively close. It's way more rural, but it's relatively close to where she's from in Wasilla. Mm-hmm. And like, she is not taken as a serious human anymore in the state of Alaska. There was a time, and I know people find this crazy, there was a time where Sarah Palin was actually not a horrible politician. She was did a lot of good things for the state as governor. And she did do some things that people really do like, especially with PFD protection, stuff like that. But
it's a bit of an aside, I know, but yeah.
Yeah, she became, after, really, I mean, she was a member of the AIP for a short while. There were things like that where she was actually like involved with the independence movement here. But once she got in kind of with the political crowd, she became a politician. Like, it was instant. Like, as soon as she got a sip of that, like, crazy juice, it was off to the races. Like, and then she moved to Arizona to try to win an office over there, and like, but yeah. So the argument goes to the UN and everything, and that had been sitting there. But in the late 80s, 89, and the way that I kind of got this information was, I mean, it had always been an open like thing where people knew that there had been communications between Iran and Vogler. The problem is that those aren't letters sent through the UN from Iran to Vogler. Those are letters from Ali Khamenei to Vogler. And the problem with that is that when Vogler eventually, his house was searched, things like that, there was never really access given to documents. That was why people didn't have a full copy of the UN drafting before 2020. Was the same reason. And so, but I was able to, through the Internet Archive and certain things, find a blog that was operated by one of the secretaries of the Alaskan Independence Party during the time that Vogler was it went missing, and during the time that all this stuff sort of came to a head.
Yeah.
And
so let's, like, it's an important aspect, I think, of the story of Joe Vogler is the mysterious thing here, right? Like, so there's an elephant in the room that we've been waiting to talk about. It is important to recognize that I think you need that context to understand the fact that these documents have been hidden for so long, to understand why that's such a serious thing, right? So the final tale of Vogler, the end, is, I think, contextualizes that.
So in 92, late 92, he was sort of just vanished in a sense. There was a next door neighbor who lived literally like just basically the equivalent of like an acre of land away from him. And
this was a few weeks before he was set to speak to the United Nations about Alaskan independence. Yes, he disappears mysteriously.
He gets letters back and forth. Ali Khamenei agrees to sponsor him. He gets word he's going to fly to New York City and have an opportunity to speak at the UN. He tells most of the key figures of the AIP, like 8 or 9 people, this. He also tells the party secretary this and puts it on his schedule. he then goes home and prepares to head out, right? Whatever he's got to do at his home and everything like that is what most people had assumed and told the cops later on. But once he goes home, there's really not, there's some people who talk to him on the phone, things like that. Then his neighbor walks by his place to go check on him, go talk to him, realizes that the house is locked up. His animals aren't outside. He had 5 dogs. He had a guard goose. A lot of people in Alaska have...
Pause.
Yeah.
Knowing that this man had a guard goose, I know this is the juicy bits of the missing persons and murder or assassination of Joe Vogler. But the man had the fact that the guard goose was in its cage was something that gave his neighbor worry is like, it's the most Alaskan thing I've ever heard in my entire life. Like, who the fuck has a guard goose?
My grandmother used to have a goose, and they make great guard animals. They will fuck somebody up if you give them the opportunity. Those animals will hurt you. But yeah, I mean, that. He had, some rural property, so he was used to having like livestock and stuff, and
his vehicle was there. The other key problem was his vehicle is there and everything's locked up. Like what? Right. Like it's not like he's gone for the day and his vehicle's gone. His vehicle's parked in his driveway and everything's locked up.
So his neighbor knocked on the door, and I don't have any written testimony anywhere as to whether or not he heard dogs barking, and that sort of comes into play later on. But he reports Vogler is missing. Another day later, the cops come by. They find the place empty. They find the 5 dogs inside the home. There's obviously feces, things like that built up. There's the goose is locked in its cage, and everything is locked inside the house. The house was closed up, and his vehicle's there. His fedora is missing. His I can't get a confirmation whether it was a 32 or a 22, but he had a small caliber handgun that was missing, and his jacket, things like that. Basic, wallet.
But his vehicle is there. The animals are locked up.
Vehicle's there. Everything's there. There's no sign of a struggle. The police do an investigation of the outside of the place, of all the porch units, of the ground, of the floor of the house, things like that. The door frame.
And they brought dogs, and the dogs smelled nothing.
Yes, and there was nothing there. There was no sign of a struggle. There was no blood, nothing. Then the police sort of give out their preliminary ideas as to what had happened. Now, Vogler at this point is in his late 80s. They put forward the idea that he just walked into the woods somewhere near his home and disappeared. Maybe he had a moment of lucidity, or lost consciousness, or had a heart attack or something, and just hasn't been found. Even though cadaver dogs at that point in the area, nothing was found.
Yeah, just for the record, the official story after the police investigate at his home is that a man that is set to speak before the United Nations in 2 weeks is just at that amount of time to the head of the party that is in charge of the government of Alaska. Had a moment where he just kind of had a dementia moment, locked up his house and his dogs, and did something really weird to his dogs, which I'm sure he'll get into a little bit later. Right? Did something really weird to his dogs, locked up everything, and then wandered into the woods and died so fucking far away that the cadaver dogs couldn't pick up a trace of anything. That is the official story from the police investigating, which is the most absurd fucking thing I can possibly imagine.
Yeah, and I have to give some credit. He's passed on now, but Jack Coghill, who was the lieutenant governor of the state, he's sort of a legend around the state here. That guy never bought the story, and he was I have a quote from him in the documentary saying that the idea that this happened the way that they say it happened is just insane, sort of going through some of that. But what ends up going on is the AIP don't like the way the police investigation was going from the jump. And they believe at this point that either Vogler had been kidnapped and was going to be, was either already dead or dead, or that he had left to maybe go to his wife's gravesite, which was in Dawson. So they contacted family over there. They found out that wasn't the case. So then they immediately turned to, well, okay, he's either been kidnapped or he's been, disappeared, sort of. And they hire an ex-cop, private investigator, who starts looking into the case. He immediately got the dogs drug tested. And the 5 dogs come back as having a sleeping drug, basically, a type of sleeping pill. Had been used on the dogs. And the excuse that the police gave for this in the reports are that these dogs were drugged by Vogler himself because he was preparing to take them to the vet in the following 4 days. And which makes absolutely no sense. I've had dogs my whole life. I've never given my dog sleeping pills to take him to the vet. And the vet, who was local to Fairbanks, told the AIP investigator as well as the media that was horseshit. That wasn't the
he
case.
doesn't.
Vogler
From what I understand, he never had. But not only that, he didn't have a habit of housing them at the vet.
No, and he never. His dogs. I mean, Alaskans. The dog culture is sort of part of the way people have homesteads here. Dogs have been sort of, everybody has them. It's Huskies and Malamutes and Labs, and that's everywhere here. German Shepherds. And so his dogs were treated like family. They're, fed in his home. They were treated like family. The idea this guy was going to dope up his dogs because he was going on vacation or sending them to the vet is just horseshit.
Right. What I mean to say is maybe a non-Alaskan doesn't quite understand is that it is normal today in America,
to
in
dock
cities,
your dogs, yeah.
Right, to dock your dogs. I don't know that there's no evidence to suggest that this would have been normal for Joe Vogler to do. He would have had someone,
neighbors
local neighbors would have came in and fed the dogs. He would never have not even just doping the dogs, but he never would have it's very unlikely that he would have taken them to the vet to be housed while he was in New York. He would have had his neighbor come in and check on his dogs. Even if he was going to do that, he wasn't going to fucking drug his dogs. Yeah. The only reason the dogs would have been drugged is because someone wanted access to the house, or somebody wanted to do something in the house and didn't want to harm or hurt the dogs or be seen.
Right. And so there's a stagnation in the case of his missing persons, and that's how it was treated at that point by the media, but by AIP members and everybody in the know. Everybody was treating it as a murder at that point. He goes missing and is gone for 9 months before there's a radio show 8 months in. Jack Coghill, one of the reasons why I give this guy a lot of credit, attacks the cops and local police department, and he blasts the federal government on a radio show that was fairly well known at the time in Alaska, and talks about the fact that Vogler still hasn't been found, and the police have suspects, but they haven't done anything about this, and they're not really trying to solve this case. And it pushes the public sort of scrutiny, especially in Fairbanks, where this guy was known, to sort of push for some answers. And up until that point, there were these signs saying, "Where's Joe?" That had been going around town and things like that were very ominous that the AIP had made. That were sort of trying to get through to people that this wasn't a normal event. So what ends up going on is they go through that whole process, and the public outcry and things start. And around that same time, a call is made to the Fairbanks Police Department, to the Crime Stoppers troopers. Supposedly, we don't have any evidence that this call was ever made. We don't have evidence of who made the call. It was all kept anonymous. And only one person heard the call, and it wasn't the main investigator or anybody involved in the case. And this was a tip coming in from somebody who said that their truck was returned to them with a bullet hole in the hood of the truck, and that it had been repainted recently. Now, the police investigate this, And then they come to the conclusion that the person who had been driving the truck was a guy named Manfred West, who's sort of colloquially termed in the prison system as Cartoon Freddy. He was a 2-bit criminal in Alaska, but he had become sort of known in Fairbanks. He did, like, you know, robberies and short-term fraud, things like that, check crimes mostly. But he had been charged with burglary and with check fraud, and had been charged with 2 felonies connected to that. And he'd been sentenced, and he was released by the state to a halfway house. And he was staying in that halfway house for less than 8 hours. When he was released by the halfway house, we don't know who made that order, and we don't know how that decision was made. He was released from the halfway house and went to his stepbrother's cabin, and was staying in that cabin. So the police found out that he...
Real quick. So when he was released, when we say released, just for clarity's sake, he was not done his tenure at the halfway house.
No.
This is like
his sentence was not finished.
Right. Like, this is like he may have, for whatever reason, way too early gotten like a weekend or a day pass or something. And then once he was out, you know, released, but it's like he's supposed to come back, go back to sleep there. He dips out and goes to his stepbrother's cabin.
Right. And on top of this, when he flew into the state of Alaska previously, before being charged with the burglary charges, he did so under a fake name. A name that has no reference to any person. It was a completely made up, just facade, with a fake address, fake information, everything, which is definitely strange, and not something that
to be fair,
you can't do. I mean, everybody could have done it.
A guy that's constantly in trouble with the law for robbery and also check fraud, not that weird that he has a fake name or alias that he comes into. Probably saw it in a movie and was like, this is a smart idea. This will keep him off the trail.
Right. He does, the cops view him as the one that was driving the vehicle. We don't know how they come to that decision, but they decide he was the one that was driving the truck that had the bullet hole in it. So they decide they want to talk to him. Now, the decision is made. Again, I don't know how this decision is made, and I'll get to why, because all these documents are sort of sealed up. But the decision is made to, rather than wait for Manfred West to leave the cabin, to use an RV, to fill that RV with officers, and then to sort of surround the building with officers, and to barricade him in to attempt to, get him out of the building. He's seen in the window by cops with a rifle, allegedly. There's a phone call that goes on between him and another officer while he's in the cabin. And in this call, which is not recorded...
They're just following the Waco playbook, right?
It like literally is, by the way. It is.
Don't let...
It is...
It's 1-to-1.
They could have just waited this guy out. He had no food. Like, you could have just sat there for a day or two, and he would have had to have walked outside the cabin. He didn't have a vehicle either, from my understanding. So instead, they just basically decided to push this guy, who they knew was not mentally stable and was a criminal, into a sort of corner, which leads to him allegedly admitting on this call that he has killed Joe Vogler. That... Yes. He went to Vogler's home.
On a 3-hour phone conversation with police.
Yes. That he allegedly went to Vogler's home. There was an argument over property. That Vogler and him exchanged fire. Vogler fled, and he shot him while he was running from him.
Pause. Not just an argument over property, right? But an incredibly convenient argument that allows Joe Vogler to be involved in the possible purchase of explosives, since he's obviously a radical, crazy person, right? And that this guy was supposedly offering to sell him C4 explosives, and then Vogler told him basically to fuck off. And then at that point, shoots at him.
Vogler tried to remove him from the property, is what he said, allegedly.
Yeah.
Again, we don't have proof that he actually said any of this on the call, which is sort of a weird thing. There's no like recording of any of this, so it makes it sort of tricky. But he told him allegedly that Vogler attempted to remove him from the property, and that he drew his gun, and that he shot at him, but he missed, and so he returned fire, hit Vogler. Vogler ran from him, and while Vogler was running from him, he shot him a second time and killed him. The problems with that we can get into here in a second, but that's supposedly what he admitted to in the call. Shortly thereafter, he tells the officer, James McCann, that was the guy's name, Sergeant McCann. He tells McCann, who was interviewed a few times about this, that he was there was explosives, dynamite, and live ammunition in the building, and that he was lighting the place on fire. And so he hangs up the call shortly thereafter. The cabin's engulfed in flames. Again, the police and fire department make the decision, because they're worried about initial explosions, to let the building burn completely, to not attempt to put it out. They put fire on it after they can get, they put water on it after they can get close enough. And it's my belief they didn't expect to find him dead. They probably literally wanted him dead, because that was a close to this whole story entirely. Instead, what ends up happening is he had fallen into the crawl space of the cabin, and all the water that they sprayed collected in that space. And so he was just hypothermic, lying in the bottom of this fucking pool. And so they pull the guy out. They put him in jail. He lives.
Chat, he lives. They're watching the building burn, and then they're like, all right, let's go get the corpse. And he's sitting in a pool, protected in water, hypothermic in the crawl space. And they're like, well, that changes things, right?
Right, and at this point, you have fire department on scene, so it makes it a lot harder for, say, the cops who might be dirty to hide this stuff, because you've got community members who are volunteers and people like that who know who Vogler is, know what the Manfred West guy was being connected to. So it becomes a lot harder to sort of brush it under the rug. And, they put him in jail, but at that point, they didn't actually have enough to charge him with the murder of Vogler. They had this confession, but they had no body. They had no murder weapon. They had no anything. And it's not until a month and a half, 2 months later.
And they may or may not have had any recording of the call.
Of a confession, right. So they just have the James McCann saying that this happened. And so what ends up going on is, after about a month and a half, 2 months of him being in jail and this really going nowhere, they have him on his other charges from previous, and they have him on arson of the cabin, was what they were holding him on. Then they get another anonymous tip. Again, we have no evidence of this call actually taking place. We don't have the names, anything. Everything's anonymous. This guy's supposedly cellmate of Manfred West. Cellmate of Manfred West tells them that he knows the location of Vogler's body. They go out to this location and find Vogler's body buried in a shallow grave. He has a gunshot wound to his head, and he has a gunshot wound to his chest. Which is, they believe, I think the cause of death was actually the gunshot wound to the head, because it was delivered second, but I don't know the exact forensics. But I know somebody who was there when they found the body, so I got some of that as reference.
Tim, you did your work.
Well, being connected to the state made it a lot easier, and I know a lot of people who were politically active in that sort of day and age that are old-timers now in my area, so it was easy to get a hold of a lot of the people. And I was amazed at how much stuff I was able to find through the Internet Archive, through blogs of people who talked about this in the early 2000s. Including, again, I found the blog of the girl who's now a writer, but she was the secretary for the party during that time and kept impeccable notes on the whole thing. And so a lot of what I got was from her. She connected a lot of dots that I didn't really have good detail on. They were like, no, we have like the schedule input here of where they were going to meet, what time, why they were doing this, things like that. But after he goes through getting arrested and they find the body, they charge him with murder. And everybody kind of at this point stops because the AIP thinks that this is a conspiracy at this point. They're at this point in the belief that he's a patsy of some sort. And that goes along with because he was connected to the AIP briefly. Manfred West was, in the sense that Manfred West did like some signage stuff and some artwork things for Vogler for ads and stuff, but he wasn't really connected to the he was connected enough to the inner workings of the party to know how things worked, and he knew who Vogler was because he was one of the first people he had met in the state, but he didn't know like the political activity side of it, like the governor thing, stuff like that. What ends up going on after he gets charged is everybody's sort of waiting with bated breath for a trial, but then the trial comes and goes, and what ends up happening is he comes out in a bulletproof vest and he pleads no contest to the charges in return for reduced sentencing and better prison placement. And in Alaska, we have some pretty rough prisons. If you go to maximum security here, you're very likely to find a lot of people who were fans of Joe Vogler, who knew who he was and the message that he had. There's a lot of old-timer Alaskans that were in prison at that time. You go to minimum security, and you might find a lot more two-bit criminal types that Manfred West blend in with. You're going to have a better time with guards. You're going to be able to put yourself in a much better situation. You're going to be protected, basically. And so that's what happened with him. He got to go to basically what is equivalent to the plushest prison in the state at the time, which was Palmer Correctional. And I, again, was lucky enough to know a family friend who was in charge of one of the prisons here in Alaska, was one of the cell block guards. And when Manfred West was transferred, because they were remodeling the Palmer prison, he was moved to the prison that she was the cell block guard at. And so she was kind of inundated with a lot of his sort of antics in the prison system and got to kind of know kind of what person he was. And, her one thing she said is Manfred West talks about everything and lies about everything. The guy was he knew he was in jail for the rest of his life, and so he'll spin you a tale in a second to make sure you like him or make sure you're going to give something to him, and that's just sort of how he plays the prison system. And when I heard that, and then you put that in context to how the guy got caught and how everything happened, Jack Coghill's quote saying that for Manfred West to have done this murder, it would have had to have been the cleanest extraction that anybody has ever seen in the history of extractions.
Right, because supposedly, just for the record, according to both the police narrative and his narrative, which has changed multiple times, but in all, the one similarity is that this murder supposedly occurred at Joe's home.
In his yard.
In his yard. Where within range, very easy range of hearing those gunshots from his neighbors who stay at home and would have come and checked on the situation, presumably.
And what adds to that is that Manfred West claimed to the police that he sat there and waited after killing Vogler for hours because he assumed the cops were going to be coming. And it goes, okay, listen, I've lived in the state of Alaska my whole life, and I lived in Big Lake, which is rural enough that you don't have immediate neighbors. We owned an acre of land. The next neighbor was another acre away. That's just how it works. You don't have these immediate homes. If I fire my 22 or 30-06 or a AK or AR on that property, you hear it a mile away, let alone an acre away. So the idea, because sound travels when you don't have a ton of like cityscapes and stuff, it's just open space and mountains and shit. So the idea that the neighbors wouldn't have heard that, and again in Alaska, we're just sort of listening for that. If you hear that, it normally means, there's a dog on somebody's property, there's an animal, there's somebody shot a bear, somebody shot a moose, or a person. And so that's where your head sort of goes at that point. So it never made, and I think Jack Coghill.
The cadaver dogs were brought there. Like that's the huge difference. It's one thing if he murders him. If you take out the cadaver dog, like take out all dogs out of the equation, his story almost makes sense with him lying about staying there. But
right.
The murder can kind of make sense, right?
Well, and
he gets into a dispute, he kills him, he puts him in his truck, he leaves.
Right.
But once you bring in cadaver dogs, right? The cadaver dogs are not going to be thrown off of the scent of a body a day later that was killed in this person's yard. And then once you add in the drugged dogs situation and the state's narrative, and then you have the really curious timing. A few weeks before he's about to be represented by Iranian government at the United Nations as he's the leader of the state's party that is in power, making a legal argument as a lawyer to the United Nations on Alaskan independence and a referendum calling for a vote. The story smells the high heaven.
Yeah, and when he, when Vogler's, when the trial went to where it did, and the decision was made for no contest to be given, what a lot of people didn't realize at the time, and that has become now the biggest issue with this case, is when somebody pleads no contest, there's never a trial, and so there's never an examination of evidence, which means the statements of the police officers are never brought back up, which means none of this stuff was ever put into the public record.
He didn't plead guilty, right? Which would still have put all of this in public record.
Exactly.
At least, unless there was some special interest to seal certain aspects of it. But still, a majority of shit like the phone call that supposedly happened, the records, the telephone records, where that came from, all of that would have been public knowledge. But by pleading no contest, none of this is public record. Everything is
sealed. And,
the UN unsealed their letter in 2020, as opposed to 1993. We have all of this information available.
Right. And so the people who were dealing with the case in real time, obviously, pretty much immediately realized, oh, this is a complete work. Like, they have this locked down. And really what they view that as, and myself, is that Manfred West was a patsy that was sort of perfect in a sense because he was already doomed for prison. And so you have a guy who you can go to and say, hey, we need you to clean up this mess. You know the party, and you know Vogler, so he's going to let you get close to him. He's going to let you, because you've worked with him in the past. You need to go work this out. And maybe the plan was to just put him in a position where he couldn't have traveled. Maybe the plan was to kill him. But however the plan played out, I do believe that Jack Coghill and people at the time who were talking about it were right when they said, there's no way that this 100 and some odd pound wily drug addict who was Manfred West, which he was at the time, moved Vogler's limp body wrapped in a tarp into the back of a truck without there being any evidence of that taking place.
Right. Bleached the entire scene, recovered bullets.
And you're talking about a yard that isn't this we're not talking about a concrete yard. We're talking about dirt. We're talking about snow and grass and things that are going to be disturbed. He has a wood porch, which you would have found, powder burn, things like that would have been bred in wood, which is all things that they would have been looking for at the time. It's not like it was archaic in the early 90s. Even in Alaska, we had ways of finding murderers. We had done it many times before. So they came to the conclusion that there was no evidence of a struggle, no sign of a struggle at all on the property. To me, what that tells me is either Vogler wasn't killed on that property, or those dogs were drugged and he was killed either by Manfred West in a very clean way because he had other people with him who were operating in the murder, or because it was a much more calculated killing and wasn't even done by Manfred West at all, and his involvement is completely negligible. He was simply there after the fact and is able to be tied in because of these anonymous calls.
While we're in who fucking knows, right? When I hear this story, this is like if I had to posit a hypothesis, right? If I was forced to be like, what happened? Because let it be known, let it be clear, I have no idea, right?
Right.
But if I'm guessing, what I would say is Wes was contacted by some individuals and given money to sell explosives to Joe Vogler. Joe Vogler told him to fuck off.
Right.
And either a conflict ensued or didn't ensue, but the government or some federal agency, once they couldn't get him to have these explosives and purchasing them because they just assumed for whatever stupid reason that Joe Vogler would buy them because their view of him was this radical extremist, not actually like they don't understand, right? Like the FBI or CIA or whoever is involved is like, oh, radical extremists, offer to buy him, offer to sell him some shit.
Here's some sawed-off shotguns.
Right, exactly. They go and clean up the mess and they bury it, say nothing's wrong. This guy, West, in some way, maybe somebody actually did have a bullet hole in the vehicle or something. He ends up on the radar. People are looking for answers. And then he becomes the patsy. And
right.
At a later date, you know what I mean? Like, because I just don't see this guy being involved in the original murder.
Because he doesn't seem like the type, just his intelligent level, the type of crime he was involved in, everything. Nothing to me in his MO points to him coming up with this crime, inventing this in his head.
Right.
It all points to me to somebody.
It doesn't even seem like he would have the ability to obtain these explosives and sell them and such. Maybe he was. I don't know. Maybe. I mean, I don't know Alaska in the 90s.
There were explosives in the 90s that were openly available, but the common thing that was used was blasting charges and TNT explosives, not really as much C4. C4 could have been used in mining applications, but it wasn't really the mining applications that Vogler was doing.
Right.
And so it wouldn't, he would have to be selling them to him for some sort of act of terrorism. And the reality in that is that Vogler was pretty vehemently anti that exact thing. Everything he's basically stated throughout his political life was that of nonviolence unless you were driven to it because of something like the Second Amendment. He talked about the fact that if the federal government won't get out of Alaskan lands, then Alaskans need to take the federal government out of Alaskan lands. But what he was referring to more there is if you exhaust the legal process and you are being enslaved, through a system of governance that you don't agree with, you don't really have much of a choice but to revolt against it. It was more of a point of the founding fathers, which, again, I think a lot of people, I try to put that forward in the documentary in the beginning with the clip of Max Blumenthal that I used, which is the type of fervor that was used against the AIP during the McCain era, was really a chance for them to trash Vogler's legacy. And was really the reason why I made the documentary in the first place, because if you Googled Joe Vogler up until that point, the first thing that came up were negative clips from Fox and MSNBC and CNN from back in the McCain days, talking about how Palin had this little connection to the AIP at one point, and so we're gonna, pour over these quotes from this madman in the media. And I sort of point out the disingenuous nature of it, because you have somebody like Blumenthal who came to the state of Alaska and interviewed AIP members. And I know for a fact he was directly told by AIP leaders that we aren't a neo-Confederate thing. This had nothing to do with the arguments being made by the southern version of secessionism, things like that. And when you see him in the media, who he was on multiple shows talking about this, every time it's quoting, well, they're sort of like the neo-Confederates. And it's like, Jesus, no, not at all. Which you can, I don't care if you believe in that ideology. I really don't give a shit what people believe, as far as that stuff goes. It's more state specific. But the whole Alaska nationalism thing, and the reason I think that's important is because, again, like you mentioned in the beginning of this stream, there was a culture in every state like that, where you looked at the state as your sort of home state and things like that, and you looked for the betterment of that place. And I think the Alaska nationalism thing was exactly that. It was more of Vogler's point being, I don't really care whether you're Democrat, Republican leaning. I care that you care about independence and the fact that this vote wasn't copacetic. These things weren't done correctly. And so when you start to see movement in the UN, I think the government at that point is post-Cold War. I mean, this is at the very end, tail end, the end. And so they have to make a decision at this point. If they let this go to the UN, they are legitimately running a situation where if he gains favor, and Alaskan independence votes happens, we're post-Cold War, the economy in Alaska would be completely open. You have European oil interests that might want to build pipelines, Russian interests that might want to build pipelines, Canadian interests who might want a bigger portion of oil. And so it becomes sort of this, well, we either kill him to solve this problem, or we try to solve it once it already happens. And the government isn't really into doing that most of the time. If they can clean up a mess before it blows up in their face, I think that's what they're going to do. And, you know, another story that a lot of people don't know, too, is the story of Nick Begich, who is another very prominent political figure who was assassinated, in my opinion, here in the state of Alaska. And so this
Never even heard that name.
Well, Nick Begich was the governor of the state. And him and a guy named Hale Boggs, who was...
I feel like such a dummy for saying that, but I'm going to be honest, right? Like, I don't lie to people. This is to the best of my ability. I don't recognize it. Yeah.
He was one of the first, like, big post-statehood governors, so there's not really a big reason for you to know his name. He didn't... But what he's really known for is the land negotiations between the natives. And he wanted to give them a decent cut, and he was attempting to do what the U.S. hadn't done with previous native populations, which was actually give them a decent deal where they got a cut of all the oil money, they got a cut of all the basically every resource that was taken off a land that was originally inhabited by their people. So if it was an area where they weren't existing, then you're not going to get a cut of that land. But if it's an area that we're producing oil from that you guys lived on historically, then yeah, you're going to get a portion of the percentage of every barrel that's pulled out of the ground. And him and Hale Boggs, who was one of the people who was in charge of the Kennedy Commission, got on a plane in Alaska, disappeared, and were never seen again. Just vanished. Now, the state of Alaska is sort of known for hokey plane disappearance and stuff. There's a weird magnetism that the state has. I literally mean that. Literally, it throws off plane radars, helicopter radars, things like that. And so a lot of crashes are tied into that. Thing is, in the case of Nick Begich's plane disappearance, they used U-2 spy planes to attempt to find his plane. We now know that because the U.S. government unsealed all the documents from during the search. And Nick Begich is one of his relatives who still believes he was killed, has done a lot of research into it and found that they actually used 2 U-2 spy planes to attempt to locate wreckage or his craft and still came up empty-handed. They never even found a oil splot relating to this thing. And planes don't really go missing in that way here. Like, they do go missing, but completely missing, like gone, is sort of hard to do. Because the state's sort of wide and open, and there's not much city in between. So you sort of have a territory you know how to, as long as you grid it out. And it was like the largest plane search ever done at the time was here in Alaska for him. And they came up empty-handed. And one of Begich's family members who's been talking about the stuff for a while wrote a book about it. He believes that Begich's plane was blown up. And Begich's wife went on to marry a guy who had been arrested for blowing up planes. And then she continued to give that guy 2 businesses that are massive brewery businesses that still exist here in the state of Alaska. And that family became increasingly wealthy because of it. And she tried to...
Dude, you have an amazing idea, which is to create a show based off of what you're calling political cold cases.
Yeah.
I had never thought of putting that into its own box. I've watched obviously documentaries, there's, but there's something deeply intrinsically like interesting about those types of things. Like I remember the first time I read the Founders from the FBI vault.
Yeah.
And I was like, what in the fuck is this?
Yeah, that
right?
shit'll blow your mind.
And it's like 3,000 pages of mostly redacted shit. And you're like, hey, FBI, why is this super redacted? And they're
why
like,
all the black boxes?
And they're like, oh, we lost the originals. We only have the digital uploads, so we can't unredact them.
How's that work?
How's that? It's you just happen to not be able to unredact the stuff that's talking about CIA being involved in pedophile rings. Like, that's interesting. Or like, out near Langley, there's like a warehouse where like they kept kids in cages and they had them do goat sacrifice rituals, and there's VHS tapes of them. Well, can we get the tapes? Like instead of just
they all burned up, but we have that moon footage if you want to see it again.
I don't know, man. I might have to follow you more, or talk to you at a later date, because this has been a fascinating conversation. Like I said, I read the documentary and I read up on it, but I mean, even still, just going through it again, it's just like, it's like like when you have a toddler. Right? Maybe you don't know. You're probably not a parent. I am.
I have 4 younger brothers, so.
Okay, so you kind of understand. When a toddler is like trying to make like a round peg fit through a square hole and it doesn't work, it's like that is how I view this narrative of Joe Vogler. Is
the
like
whole
there's this
story makes no sense.
None of it makes sense. Like it's the timing is incredibly convenient. The fact that the guy lived is incredibly convenient. Instead of burning up, the 3-hour phone call is convenient. The no contest is convenient. The drugging of the dogs makes no fucking sense. None of the stories match up. None of the details match up. Over and over and over again. Like, you're left with nothing but non-answers and the state feeding you bullshit. And I think the overarching thing here that I see is, okay, if your story doesn't make sense, you go back to like a kind of a 101 thing. Means, motive, opportunity, right? And when I look at means, I go, well, the state has means. When I look at opportunity, obviously the state has opportunity, right? And so, well, what is their motive? And you have an individual who is in every way, shape, or form giving them the greatest motive. If they can make this problem disappear, this not only does this shore up the valuable assets of Alaska, not only does it stop other nations from gaining those resources or control over those resources with trade agreements with this new nation, not only does it stop them from having what could be a serious political embarrassment at the United Nations blow up in their face, but it also just happens to be the one thing tied to the one thing America has been doing since the Eisenhower Doctrine, which is protecting fiat currency of the US dollar as the reserve currency that we trade oil through and the rest of the nation, by strangling and keeping under control the gold and oil that is available in Alaska. It is the greatest motive I could ever think of, ever. And it's a fascinating story that nobody knows about.
And to add to that, I have a video on my channel. I talk about gold and stuff like that, and natural resources. If you look into, and anybody can do this with a quick Google search, just whatever state you live in, look up how much of it is owned by the federal government, and then look at some old maps. If you had a state that had an oil boom or a gold boom, look at the correlation of those maps. And I've done this with places like Oregon, California, Texas, areas that have had big gold booms. Utah is another one. These are all states that are owned 40 to 60% by the federal government. And the land that they have taken, the land that they happen to choose, always correlates with where those gold and natural resources were. And the question is, do you need a resource in your hand for it to be valuable? And the answer that has existed in the state of Alaska for hundreds of years has been no. Because if you can guarantee to somebody that there is value in that ground, that there is gold present there, and you can come up with an average of how much there is, any bank, any federal institution, any group of people will give you a loan, will give you money on that land. And so the federal government is in a position right now where they don't need to control the gold market, they control the gold. So it's a situation where I don't like when people are investing in things, it's like, I go, yeah, this is the shaky ground people are actually walking on, because those markets are like dependent on what you can pull out of the ground. And if what you can pull out of the ground is sitting on federal land, then I can show you from Joe Vogler's experience trying to pull that stuff out. It's not as easy as people think. And they can stopgap that very quickly if they think that the people are going to benefit from it. And so, I think I think Vogler's story is a almost wake-up call in the modern sense for people to go, hey, like, who controls the resources in the area you are? Because Alaska got this treatment in modern context, like this has been going on still to this day. It's already happened in most other states. They cemented this years ago, the sort of control vectors. So, I'd love to see ultimately, some new politician or person use some of Vogler's experiences and some of his writings and things to draft some kind of bill or draft some kind of piece of legislation to protect people from that kind of actions in the state. The unfortunate thing is the government, in a way, with Vogler, and this is the bittersweet part of the story, is they sort of won in a way, because when they killed Vogler and they got rid of him, it did kill the AIP. After Walter Hickel was gone, another AIP candidate never took governor again. The percentages of the votes plummeted. And a lot of the diehard AIP guys got this sort of idea in their head, because they saw it happen, that if we get to the point where we actually get a vote, they'll just stock the vote again, or they'll kill the people who are trying to bring it forward. And so a lot of the fervor to sort of push the political side of it died off. And there's still a cultural angle to the AIP sort of movement in rural areas, where you still see people who are like, more independent in culture, but less in politics. But they definitely were successful in killing off the strong nature that existed at the time of the AIP. And today, even now, the party is structurally pretty sad. They don't have a ton of activity.
So what's interesting about you say that, you've affirmed multiple times, while we were talking, that you consider yourself a libertarian, right? Not necessarily an AIP one-to-one guy, right? And what I find interesting about that is utilizing and understanding the culture of the AIP and the history there, and kind of resurrecting it from a libertarian perspective, right?
That's
because
exactly,
it has a new relevance as hopefully as libertarianism begins to spread. I think libertarianism, despite the fact that we are fighting an uphill battle for sure, is almost, people say like, oh, you guys will never be anything. And I agree to that in a lot of ways, that it's a difficult thing. But what I've noticed in the last 5 to 10 years is conservative pundits never uttered the word the state. And now they say the state, right? Like there's clearly a shift of the language and the way that the libertarians have been speaking in America since the 1970s that paleo-conservative strategy is starting to pan out. And I think you're seeing it within the populist movement of the right wing, especially is a recognition of the dangers of the state. You know what I mean? Like 10 years ago.
I think younger people, as much as the politician class, the sort of elite class, hate to see it, are sort of filling a void that I don't think even I realized would happen, which is that I sort of, coming at the age I am at 23, a lot of the people I see politically my same age are frankly not the most intelligent. I don't really get along with conversating with a lot of them because of the politics they hold. But I've seen more and more people in this like 25 to 30 year block, the people who are just slightly older than me. They have impressed me a bit in the way that they've sort of curb-heeled some of the political, I'll say stereotypes. It was a lot on sort of the hipster political strategies that were hoisted on that generation. And in reality, I think those people are going to be the ones that sort of bring that new era of culture in, because it's almost by force. They don't, like, their point of view at this point is like, politicians are bad. And so it almost doesn't matter what side of the fence they are politically if what they're going to do is push out those sort of political class of people, then that's going to be good in general. I think it moves us in the right direction because those people are more in tune with culture today in general. It doesn't matter whether they believe in the same things as us, as much as it is that they're just culturally pliable compared to people in their 70s, 80s who might not have as much in touch.
God, I wish I had that much of a white pill. The way I look at populism throughout history and its current surge in America and in that generation, right? I'm ever so slightly older than that group you described, 32. And what I see with populism is kind of an element of chaos. And what I mean by that is people realize the system is broken and they kind of and populism emerges. And populism is a very baseline kind of how you described it. It's an ideology. It says, look, there are these people that want to control me, that want to govern me, that want to rule me, that want to destroy me. These are the elites. And then I identify ideas with those elites, and anybody that supports those ideas are on the side of the elites, and anybody that is against those ideas are on the side of the people, right? So, it starts off with the elites are a problem, and then it's like it grows in like, well, ESG, right? World Economic Forum ideas, or the destruction of the seizure of farmland from the Danes, right? And saying that they're not allowed to legally own farms if their farms are seized, right? You start seeing the eat the bugs, right? Like certain ideas get championed by the elites, and then we attach people that support or tacitly support those things. And all of that's great. And I'm with you. It's really great. It's an awakening. The problem is that I see is that populism doesn't offer a prescription.
Oh,
Populism,
yeah, no, you're 100% right there. I don't see a solve with the newer, younger class of like political thinkers I see coming up. It's weird if they're like I'm talking mainly about the ones that are actually politically active. The problem I see with all of the movements, and this isn't just libertarian, I'd say this is the sort of liberty Republicans as well, is there's sort of this concept that we're going to get in charge and make change. It's like, yeah, but here's the thing. I've seen people get in charge. Change didn't happen. You can't just say you're going to do an action and then use the same powers. It's sort of the Matt Walsh effect I think we've seen a bit. Yeah. Where he's, it's like, yeah, clearly if you got the power, you would yield this power to do just as horrible things. It would just be in the political reverse. And so
that's what I actually fear.
There is a 100% danger that we are running course into, and I 100% see it, that the younger class shepherding in sort of this anti-oligarchy, kind of anti-elitism sort of reign of politics, in 10 years, that's going to most likely look like a swing back of the pendulum that will make it seem much more closer to the politics of the even 60s, 70s, where the Republicans are...
Yeah, so... moving that concept a little bit further, what I see is people yearn for prescriptions once they identify the problem. And so then they're going to turn to some ideology that does offer prescriptions and also has a narrative that supports the populist ideology that they latched onto that woke them up. And the best way that I see this is they're going to turn to socialism, communism, fascism, or libertarianism. There's really, and that's basically all of those ideologies say, yes, the elites want to fuck you over. They control you. They punish you.
But they have different
we have an answer
to solve it.
Right. And so I made this, I was on a panel damn near a year ago at this point, with Blair White. I hosted a panel with Blair White and Buck Angel and Taftaj and Tulip R. Ritchie, Chloe Cole. We were talking about
back and forth with Buck Angel occasionally.
Buck Angel's great. He's the sweetest grandpa ever. And so we were talking about trans issues and stuff. And I remember, I
think I've heard part of this conversation, in fact.
Maybe. And so I brought up this idea of the pendulum swing. And I was like, conservatives, like what happens when conservatives recognize that they can no longer control the public school system, and they can no longer control the massive gender theory and critical and queer theory that is being pushed onto their children, where they simply say, fuck it all, get rid of transgenders. Like they're all a problem, and everyone that supports them. And I remember Blair White like laughed at me, dismissed me, and I think she hated me from that point on. I don't know that she does, but like she never followed me on Twitter or anything. Like, and it was like, wouldn't talk to me anymore after that. And I'm like, okay, like she doesn't want anything. She did not like this panel.
Probably understood that a lot more.
Yeah, and like she just laughed at it and said it was an absurd idea. And then like fast forward 8 months, 9 months or so, and you have Matt Walsh and you have, you know, what's that? Michael Knowles and them, and they're like, we must eradicate transgenderism from public life. And then she's like, why would you say that? And I'm like, bitch, I told you. Like this is the fear that I have is that people are going to want easy answers to these problems, and the easy answers are fucking grab your brown shirt, boys. Let's fucking get rid of these people.
If you want another solution in a different context, another exact sort of what I see as the same thing, you know, I have a lot of friends in the libertarian space even that will make arguments that we need armed guards. This is the term that I've heard used, armed guards at schools. And I was homeschooled. I never went to a public schooling institution. I didn't do homeschooling with curriculum. I did it with just self-taught most of the time. And you know, but I was very in tune with the public school system. I've done volunteering and things like that, and so I know how that works. And I tried explaining early on to people, I was like, understand that the conservatives who are going to push for that they don't understand that a compliance officer and an armed guard, or whatever term they want to apply to that, means the same thing. It means a cop is going to be selected from whatever precinct is closer to that school. That police officer is going to be put at that school, and that's going to be the return of that. The problem I had with that from the jump is there was an easier solution from the beginning, which is that adults in the country are supposed to have Second Amendment rights. They're supposed to have the right to carry a firearm. Regardless of whether you believe in the Constitution as being this actually effective document or not, that's what it says. You have teachers who already work at schools, who can take training, firearm training classes, are in plain clothes, and can carry firearms without it adding extra tension to the other teachers, without it adding this outward uniformed person constantly hovering over those students. It removes that social problem that I have with you having a situation where every school has to have uniformed officers standing in it and it does to me, it brings in that social aspect of what does that do to kids over time? Like,
so I would say this. Like I recognize your concern, right? Like the right answer, which no one is willing to adopt, is the abolishment of public schools. Yeah, right?
I'm with you.
That's
there,
the right
by
answer.
The way. Like, we agree there.
Right. Like the right answer is abolish public school and stop taking an average of $4,000 a year from every American in the United States.
7,800 in Alaska.
It's I from what I understand, it's I mean, like it's based off property values. Some of it's based off state. It's complicated.
School district is like the most expensive here, and it's crazy when you break down the numbers, because you realize, like, again, as somebody who was homeschooled and stuff, and it's like once I got past like what I would call a 4th grade level, I was pretty much at the point where my dad would just say, learn about whatever you want to learn about. You have a library card, rent the books. You know, if you need help, ask me what you need help on. I'll give you guidance. I did everything by myself at that point. My other brothers did the same thing. And when I'm in conversation with people, again, in my same age bracket, who I'm friends with to this day, who went through the public school system, graduated, had, you know, middle of the 3 GPAs, things like that. You know, I don't mean to sound like an asshole to the guys, but it's the lack of understanding of history, lack of understanding of political nuance, of how all the world functions in reality is just not there.
Well, I mean, like, the public school system is designed to teach you what to think, not how to think.
Yeah. And I learned that at a very young age.
So it's very true that, like, I think a lot of homeschoolers sometimes might miss certain important things within their education.
Oh, definitely. The social aspect of it.
Not anymore. That's
the way I was homeschooled, for the record, because we were in a cabin.
Well, you're in Alaska.
I grew up, this is always the crazy fact I tell people. I grew up on an acre land. We had a 650 square foot, 1-room log cabin, and we had 8 people living in it. And we had bunk bed systems, and you went to bed, and most of the learning was done outside, and you cut firewood, and you had propane stove, and you hitchhiked. I used to play Magic the Gathering. I would have to hitchhike or find a ride and go in. You'd have to like go to the neighboring town to go find somebody to play cards with. Like,
oh, God.
Like that's how I grew up. So, like, it was rural, but not as rural as rural Alaskans. So
but
it's
getting back to the topic on of the school situation. Look, I kind of agree to a certain extent that armed guards are a solution. Do I think they're the best solution? No, but I mean, if your goal, your specific goal is how do we stop mass shootings? Better security at the schools is without a doubt one. They don't have mass shootings in Israel because you go through a fucking checkpoint of armed guards before you get into school, despite the fact that there are people that are trying to blow up schools constantly. They don't have this problem because enough security does solve that problem. Now, the unintended consequences, as you described, of having armed guards at every school and creating schools to be even more like a prison system and even more like a demand to respect some form of, unjustified legal authority that is armed over top of you. I don't know what those psychological effects are. I don't tend to think that they are going to be positive, right? But I mean, I'm fully against school choice, but that's just because I've done my research on it with people like Lisa Logan and Deb Philman.
I've heard 2 really interesting arguments on, and I haven't done enough. My understanding, and this is why I had sort of an issue with it off the bat, the way it was explained to me, was you're still forcing sort of a set amount to be set aside out of the tax dollar. So in reality, in the system, you're not actually doing anything, quote, like from the libertarian perspective, there's nothing really libertarian happening there. In reality, all you're doing
adage.
Right, it's just an adage to the current rule that also, like, to me, is going to prop up a state-funded private school system, which I don't think a lot of people realize how many private schools are done that way. Private school,
if you don't understand what that means, just picture in your head what private prisons look like and how bad those are when you realize that it's a state-funded private monopoly, and then think, compare regular prisons to state-funded private prisons, and then compare the two.
Yeah.
The real thing is, the real argument that I've heard from people that really look at this shit, from like Lisa Logan and Deb Philman, people that I've, connected with to some degree, is that when you have state funds, with that comes a certain set of power of the demands of those that are taxed.
State funds came great responsibility.
Right, which is teachers unions and other politically interested and motivated actors say, well, you're taking my tax dollars, so I have demands based off of the fact that my tax dollars are going to these things. And the United Nations, UNESCO, right, have their own published research saying that we will use a public-private partnership as a means of forcing social emotional learning, critical theory, by a new name, et cetera,
so
into the entire education system.
You're handing the government the ability to build a new monopoly, basically. I mean, one that they already have control of, but really they're co-opting the new monopoly, I guess is really the way to put it.
Right. Like what they're doing, what it's doing is it allows more state tendrils into the private education system that is already in dubious circumstance. To give the school choice people credit where credit is due, I do think in the interim, right, while your own kids right now are in school, it does give you the ability, if you are an informed parent, to move your child from a school where it is worse to a school where it is better. where there's less indoctrination,
Yeah, but you
where
don't
there are less
necessarily
problems.
have to do the whole school choice movement to get to that solution. You could do that.
Right.
Without
They
the
just
rest
as
of it.
they just as easily could give everybody education credits if they choose to get out of the public school system that they could use anywhere or that they could use towards homeschooling. But even that is dangerous. The only real thing that in the long term solves this problem is a reduction in taxes and a reduction in funding
Well,
that
I'll
allows
tell you-
people more money so that they can do homeschooling co-ops and things like that.
I'll tell you what I have more experience in that regard too is most people who go, I want to homeschool my kids. The first thing that they're doing is the worst thing you can do, which is they're going to whatever the largest homeschooling institution in their area is, which is typically running through a state allotment system. And that state allotment system means they have 8 or 9 programs that are going to be selected from. And those programs are literally written by the same people who write the books that are in the public school system. So you're a lot of, and I mean, this is most homeschooling parents, by the way, it's not like a small percentage, are teaching their kids with documents that do exactly what the public school system does. It's the same thing. It's pure hoard, just
Well,
slog.
before we get too deep in this, I want to bring my co-host back in because we told an amazing story of Joe Vogler, the AIP, and obviously bringing a little bit more conversation on that. I'm sure Mark has at least a question or two about that entire situation. And I also want to thank you for your time and the effort that you put in speaking to locals, speaking to family members, looking through documents, trying to tell a story that needs to be told. That is just wild. I really do appreciate it as well. But I want to bring him in because we could go off the rails all night. And then before we know it, this stream is just two libertarians chit-chatting about random shit.
Yeah,
we do want to keep it somewhat controlled for the audience because they're like, all right, well, glad the story's over,